We'll hear from Aidan tonight. He's going to be on a panel tomorrow here in the church when they discuss what freedom means to us. So you're very welcome to come along to it at 11 o'clock here in the church. Also tomorrow we have the Lisburn Harmony Ladies Choir at midday. We have the Mono Trio with Winnie Amma in the evening. And then on Sunday afternoon at 3:30 we have the Ulster Consort, including our own musician in residence, the harpist Tanya Houghton. And we also have a Sunday service every Sunday here at 10:30, where we are a liberal congregation within the non-subscribing Presbyterian Church. And we seek to discover the truth about what it is to be human in today's society. So, without further ado, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Aidan McQuade, invite him up to the lectern to speak to us all. Aidan.
Well, thanks very much for coming. Pleasure to see you all. And this is definitely about 4 times more people here than the last time I was speaking in Belfast, so I'm very pleased. It's a great pleasure to be in Rosemary Street because, as many of you will be aware, this is where Frederick Douglass spoke in 1845. I think there might have been a few more people there then. But it's a pity that 200 years later there's still a need to speak about slavery in the world after all the work that he did. I'm not going to cover the entire history of slavery and anti-slavery in Ireland. Slavery goes back certainly to Iron Age times, perhaps before, and to Brehon law, within which the female slave was a basic unit of currency. And I'm not going to cover the entire history of anti-slavery in Ireland, which certainly goes back as far as St. Patrick, particularly his letter to the soldiers of Caractacus, in which he protested the enslavement and trafficking of Irish people, probably by his fellow Britons. So instead, I'd like to start with the transatlantic slave trade, because that is to slavery as the Holocaust is to genocide. There has been slavery before and since the transatlantic slave trade. However, both of these events represent the moments when entire political economies focused the apex of their industrial organization on these grotesque human rights abuses. Now, the transatlantic slave trade still casts a long shadow on the contemporary world, as we have seen recently in some of the events, particularly William and Kate's visit to the Caribbean in relation to the Platinum Jubilee. So I think it's important to understand some of the key facts and issues that emanate from that. So this is Elmina Castle, which is known as a slave castle. It's one of the slave castles along the coast of Ghana. I visited it a few years ago. It was the centre of the Dutch slave trade, but there was British, French and Portuguese castles at other points along the coast. These castles were essentially human warehouses where the journeys of most African slaves to the Americas began. Now, if you do a tour of the castle, it starts in the dungeons at the base of the castle, particularly the women's slave quarters there, and that was overlooked by a balcony from the governor's apartment, which is at the top of the castle, from which he would periodically select women to rape as they were paraded below. If you travel up from the stifling heat of the dungeons at the base of the castle, you eventually proceed up to the wonderfully airy governor's apartment and the officers' quarters at the top of the castle, and with spectacular views of the sea and the surrounding coast, and the thought of such horrors in the midst of such beauty is profoundly unsettling. This is the door of no return in Elmina Castle, through which slaves would be marched onto waiting ships. Over hundreds of years, slavery devastated the African interior as wars and raids, encouraged by the European powers, kidnapped millions of people, many of them children, to feed the demand of the Americas for human beings who would be worked to death to produce cash crops, mostly for European markets. Many of you may have seen this image before. It's one of the most famous in anti-slavery history. It's the image of how it was proposed that slaves should be packed like sardines into the hold of the ship Brooke. The image was brought to world attention by my most illustrious predecessor in anti-slavery, Thomas Clarkson, essentially the founder of Anti-Slavery International. And it shocked the world. Clarkson's friend and comrade in the anti-slavery struggle, Olada Equiano, had direct personal experience of being treated as this sort of cargo, and he described it in his autobiography. He said, "We were all put under deck. The stench of the hold while we were on the coast was so intolerably loathsome, but now that the whole ship's cargo was confined together, it became absolutely pestilential. The closeness of the place and the heat of the climate almost suffocated us. Many died. The wretched situation was again aggravated by the galling of the chains, now become insupportable, and the filth of the latrine buckets into which the children often fell and were almost suffocated. The shrieks of the women and the groans of the dying rendered the whole scene of horror almost inconceivable. Every circumstance I met with served only to render my state more painful and heighten my apprehension and my opinion of the cruelty of the whites." Current estimates are that about 12 million Africans were trafficked across the Atlantic over the course of the transatlantic slave trade. Of these, it's estimated up to 2.5 million died because of the brutality of the crossing. But of course, once across the Atlantic, the brutality did not end. Professor David Blight, in his recent biography of Frederick Douglass, notes how Douglass once saw a woman called Nellie Kellum being wrestled and dragged forward towards a tree by an overseer with the peculiarly apt name of Severe. According to Douglass, 3 of Nellie's 5 children watched her being subdued and roped to a tree. As they screamed, "Let my mammy go," Severe beat Nellie to a bloody pulp while she met the blows with a fierce and indignant courage. As Douglass wrote of the events years later, he implied that the worst part for him was not Nellie's back covered with blood, but her screams mingled with those of her children. Britain sometimes congratulates itself upon the abolition first of the slave trade and then of slavery itself. But the first abolitionists were not white, but the enslaved Africans themselves. In common with Nellie Kellum, Equiano, and Frederick Douglass, thousands of others fought for their freedom in different ways. David Richardson's an economic historian, and he estimates that the extra costs that slave ship owners incurred in order to discourage or defeat insurrections on the slave ships saved many hundreds of thousands of other Africans from having been enslaved. In the United States, the black regiments of the Union Army played an important role in breaking the power of the racist Confederacy. Abraham Lincoln is perhaps the greatest figure of the 19th century and one of the most endlessly fascinating, not least because of his enduring qualities of genius, humour, and humanity. His personal experiences of child labour and child slavery may have contributed to his consistent, albeit initially cautious, opposition to slavery. But we should never forget that Lincoln, who was elected in 1860, was a racist, as casually racist as many of his white contemporaries. He thought initially that blacks and whites probably couldn't live together in the same country and supported the removal of free blacks from the United States to new colonies such as Liberia and West Africa. That Lincoln changed so fundamentally over the course of his presidency was in considerable part because of the influence of black leaders like Frederick Douglass, and perhaps most decisively because of the example of the ordinary black soldiers of the Union Army. Belfast did not have a fleet of slave ships involved in the genocidal transatlantic slave trade. As historian Philip Orr has recounted, in a 1786 venture to establish such a fleet was thwarted by the reformist citizens of the city. As Orr notes, the proposal to create a slaving company in the town outraged Presbyterian ladies like Martha McTeer and Marianne McCracken, who formed the Belfast Women's Anti-Slavery League. Slavery also outraged members of the volunteer movement of Belfast, who had been influential in gaining greater independence for Ireland within the Empire, and who in this dynamic northern town often expressed egalitarian and revolutionary views. They organised the Bastille Day celebrations on the streets of the town in the early 1790s and raised a large flag as part of the procession on which it had been painted a picture of a chained slave. It was followed by another banner which asked, "Can the slave trade, though morally wrong, be politically right?" Business people from Belfast and other parts of Ireland certainly profited through other forms of the trade with slavery, and we should also remember that one of the most repulsive racists of the 19th century, John Mitchell, an outspoken supporter of both slavery and the reinstatement of the genocidal transatlantic slave trade, is still celebrated in Ireland. To our shame, a statue in my hometown of Newry, and with his name attached to various GAA clubs. But it should still be a mark of pride for Belfast that the trafficking of human beings was not permitted to become as foundational to the city's growth and prosperity as it was for Bristol, Liverpool and Glasgow. And even as the city's radicalism waned in the 19th century, Mary Ann McCracken was still, at the age of 88, to be seen on Belfast docks handing out anti-slavery leaflets to those boarding ships to the United States. One of the people that Frederick Douglass wanted to meet in Ireland was Daniel O'Connell. O'Connell's reputation as an anti-slavery campaigner had already stretched across the Atlantic. He at one point said that of all men living, an American citizen who is the owner of slaves is the most despicable, and insisted that his movement should accept no money from American slaveholders. At one point, the US ambassador to London challenged O'Connell to a duel for referring to him as a slave breeder. But having already killed a man in one such senseless encounter, O'Connell avoided a rematch. O'Connell understood that human rights are a universal thing. This is something that Douglass, in spite of his lacuna about the plight of Native Americans, also understood. As he put it, we must enter into the troubles of others, because as such troubles affect other human beings, they must be of concern to all of us. It was an attitude that led Douglass to be an advocate for votes of women on behalf of the starving Irish. It also led O'Connell to speak out on behalf of Australian Aboriginals and the Maori people, as well as in the cause of anti-slavery. It is relevant still because too often when concerned with our own troubles, we lose sight of the fact that there are millions of others like us across the world struggling against similar domestic and transnational cliques of privilege for the same dignity, the same freedom that we dream of for ourselves. Neither O'Connell nor Douglass were flawless people, but then none of us are. And you don't have to be a saint to be a hero, even just for one day. Both men left the world better than they found it by demanding that it becomes so. Both showed, as thousands of men and women before and since have shown, that protest is leadership and that words matter. They showed that the force of an argument such as those Douglass put to Lincoln can change minds and bring people together organised around new ideas and new understandings. It's easy to say there's no use arguing, but that tends to be said by those who refuse to recognise that often arguing has changed the world. The struggle against slavery at the end of the 18th century and into the 19th century showed this. It was a time in Ireland when Catholic, Protestant and Dissenter were united in common cause, not on some trivial issue, but in something of world importance. Too often, perhaps, we get caught up in our local quarrels and feuds, but what we see in the Irish anti-slavery struggles of the past is a capacity to move beyond that sometimes. That capacity lives with this society still, and emerges from time to time in response to injustices such as war and famine overseas and poverty and pandemics at home. We see it right now in some of the responses to the war in Ukraine. But the point of studying history is not to pat ourselves on the back. It is to try to understand why the world is as it is today and to conceive of how it could perhaps be better. The transatlantic slave trade is not just a thing of the past. It imprints itself upon the present. It is a significant part of the reason why the global south is poor and the global north is rich. It is why the calls for reparations, including those that shadowed William and Kate in their recent trip to the Caribbean, are still made. It is why many black people are murdered with impunity by the police in the United States. So when some folks say, but everyone who is responsible for death and enslavement during that time are dead, bear in mind the political economic systems that still govern the planet are rooted in those exploitative systems of the past. West Africa, for example, which was devastated by the transatlantic slave trade, should be anticipating an economic boom as the rare minerals necessary for green energy technologies are in such abundance in their earth. However, the companies in West Africa currently mining such minerals do not even provide much decent employment for their workers, let alone the sorts of tax and trade revenues that could ensure decent education for the children of the region and development of a more vibrant, sustainable economy. Instead, these revenues are exported from the region to the global north, as surely as the wealth of the region was expropriated during colonial times. This continuing impoverishment of the south by the north is one of the things that drives the migration and refugee outflows from Africa, as thousands of young people fleeing the poverty and unemployment that have become a legacy of colonialism and a manifestation of the environmental degradation that has been gathering pace over the past decades. This map shows some of the main routes towards Europe used by migrants. There are additional routes from Southeast Asia through Russia, and those would have been the routes taken by the young Vietnamese who were suffocated to death in the back of a container by Irish people in 2019. Now, in 2019, I did a piece of research in Nigeria that involved speaking to people who had tried to migrate to Europe from Nigeria via Libya and across the Mediterranean in the hope of a better life. One young woman, let's call her Abebi, described her experiences. I had a terrible experience on my way to Libya. I was subject to emotional, physical, and mental torture. I had to drink the urine of my friend due to dehydration. On my arrival at the Niger border, we were attacked by Niger security personnel and spent 2 days in the forest. The truck I was transported in was attacked in the desert, and I and a group of people I travelled with spent 7 days in the desert. We were forced to dress in full body cover to disguise ourselves. We were packed into a truck and tomatoes piled on top of us to hide our identities because we had no visas. I was not spared in Libya as my hut was attacked, which led me to running for my life before I met a woman who put me to work as a prostitute in a brothel. Another migrant, let's call him Idris, described similar experiences. In January 2018, I left Nigeria in the hope of crossing the Mediterranean to Germany. The journey was tough, stressful, and dangerous. I suffered dehydration, starvation, fell ill, was tortured by bandits. I saw people drink their urine when they were thirsty. On our journey through the desert, we were attacked by bandits and lives were lost, mainly the little children who could not run. They were buried in the desert. My best friend was shot and killed on one of the occasions that we were attacked. 5 people died on my truck. Their valuables, such as phones and money, were stolen. The men who had nothing on them were beaten, while the girls and young women were raped. On my way, I was sold on, and my mother had to send money so I could regain my freedom. In Libya, I worked as a labourer and slept in the streets for 2 months before I was able to rent an apartment. Now, Idris and Abebi are amongst the lucky ones because they survived. Thousands more die in the desert or on the Mediterranean. Thousands more are simply sold into forced labour and sexual exploitation in Libya. Thousands more the British government of Boris Johnson plans to deport to the tender mercies of Rwanda, one of the bloodiest dictatorships in Africa. These horror stories are an outgrowth of European policy, that of national governments and of the EU itself, which failed to ensure economic and environmental justice in West Africa that could diminish the conditions that drive so many young people to migrate in search of a better life, having given up the hope of obtaining such a thing in their homelands. Contrast European policy towards migrants such as these with the generous policy that Europe has recently shown to Ukrainian refugees, and it's difficult to conclude that racism is not in play. In the global north, racism is still a plague whose roots can be traced back to the transatlantic slave trade. Racism was a cause and a consequence of the transatlantic slave trade. It's difficult to murder and enslave unless the individuals and societies which carry out such atrocities convince themselves that those who are being enslaved are lesser beings who deserve their fate. Racism still underpins slavery to this day because it prevents the enslavement of discriminated against groups from generating sufficient public outrage to make it a live political issue. Hence, the most vulnerable to trafficking and exploitation get little legal protection, even in liberal democracies. I hope when the North of Ireland resumes its rightful place in the European Union.
Just got a second, just checking. So it's over.
Okay.
Oh, second one, right, no worries. Hopefully that's it, sorry.
Hopefully.
Beg your pardon. Yeah.
No worries. So I was saying, I hope when the North of Ireland finally resumes its rightful place in the European Union, that the MEPs that this region elects will draw on the anti-slavery traditions of the likes of Daniel O'Connell and Mary-Ann McCracken to repudiate the overt and covert racisms that nurture slavery and exploitation in the political economies from which Europe continues to derive its wealth. There are those who said that anyone can be enslaved, and if we are unfortunate enough to get caught up in war, that can indeed happen. We see that in the fallout from Islamic State, Boko Haram, in contemporary Libya, and emerging now in Ukraine. But beyond war, it tends to be the discriminated against who are enslaved. In Europe, the scourge of slavery still affects an estimated 40 million people across the world in forced labour and forced marriage. Women are more likely to be enslaved than men. Over 70% of those in slavery today are women. In Europe, migrants are more likely to be enslaved. In India, it's Dalits, people from the caste that used to be known as untouchables. Just as colour was the basis for enslavement in the Americas in Frederick Douglass' day, caste is the basis for enslavement in contemporary South Asia. Millions of Dalits are enslaved to work in agriculture, in brick kilns and in sanitation, manually cleaning up the waste, including the shit, of the more powerful of the country. One young man described his experiences: "I studied commerce and banking, but I couldn't find work. Even though I am educated, the village council would only hire me to clean toilets because I am from the untouchable community." There was no respite from the COVID pandemic for such sanitation workers. Another Dalit sanitation worker said about his work during the plague, "At least social distancing is nothing new for us. The rest of society already shuns us." Let me describe briefly what some other manifestations of the enslavement of Dalits means. In 2010, as part of a research project I was supervising, one of our researchers spoke to the mother of a young Dalit woman who worked in a cotton spinning mill in the state of Tamil Nadu in southern India. She described visiting her daughter. "I spoke to her in a room provided for visitors," she said, "because visitors are not allowed to go inside the mill or the hostel where my daughter lived. My daughter told me that she was suffering with fever and vomiting often. I met with the manager and requested him to give leave to my daughter because she was unwell. I told him that I would send my daughter back once she was better, but the manager refused, saying there was a shortage of workers, therefore they cannot grant leave. He also assured me not to worry, they would take care of my daughter, and asked me not to worry. A week later, she received a message from the factory that she could now collect her daughter because she was dead." In spite of managing to expose these abuses in the face of considerable corporate resistance in 2012, by 2021, The Guardian reported in a new investigation into the situation, of the spinning mills of Tamil Nadu by the NGOs Somo and Arisa had found that little had changed. A worker at one of the mills spoken to by the researchers said, "We do not get proper sleep, we always have to work, we often have to work 2 shifts and sometimes even 3 shifts. This makes us feel tired and drowsy, but we cannot take any rest." Hundreds of workers had no choice but to live in overcrowded and unhygienic hostels, miles from their families, and with no paid leave. Workers described severe limitations in their freedom, saying that while they were not working, they had to remain in the dormitories and were closely monitored. Women reported feeling unsafe and that they were subject to sexual harassment in the factories and in their accommodation. They described male managers, supervisors, hostel staff, and co-workers touching them inappropriately and making sexual comments, often under the cover of loud machine noise. If this sounds distant from anyone here, bear in mind it is but one example of the sorts of routine exploitation that plagues the textile and garment sectors, from the use of forced labour in the cotton fields of Asia, to the enslavement of Uyghurs in China, to the debt bondage of young women workers in the sweatshops of Southeast Asia. It is difficult to imagine that anyone listening to me now is not clad in at least one garment tainted with slavery. The new EU due diligence law on human rights should begin to deny markets to goods produced through such exploitation practices. But as the past years have shown, there are plenty of countries now whose governments, like that of the UK, regard contempt for the human rights of the vulnerable as a badge of pride, and who will remain willing markets for such goods. And contemporary slavery is not confined to the global south. I've spent much of the past 2 weeks working with lawyers who have been endeavouring to ensure that victims of contemporary slavery are not deported to Rwanda. More than once over the past few years, I've worked with lawyers in the north of Ireland who have been desperately endeavouring to ensure that their clients are not re-victimised by state authorities who seem intent on imprisoning them for cannabis cultivation by overlooking the indications that they were trafficked into this labour under threat and violence. The year before last, I worked with the International Transport Workers Federation in support of their campaign to end the system of tied visas that made trafficked forced labour such a commonplace in the Irish fishing fleet, north and south. It's easy at the best of times to get overwhelmed by the scale of the challenge posed by contemporary slavery, and these are not the best of times. Brexit, a deeply xenophobic and often racist project, has already struck at the foundations of our peace process in Ireland. Soon its other economic and political effects will bite, increasing consumer costs, destroying jobs and businesses, and stealing the rights of young people to live, study, work and fall in love across our common European homeland. Soon this may be followed with the threatened bonfire of labour and environmental rights that many of the current British government seem so keen on, and that will increase the risks of exploitation and trafficking of vulnerable workers. The treatment of P&O workers is probably a sign of things to come, and in spite of the well-documented risks of trafficking associated with tying workers' visas to specific employers, the UK government seems intent on introducing this licence to exploit into the agricultural and other sectors. But we are not the first people to face bleak prospects. In his biography of Frederick Douglass, the American historian David Blight described Douglass as personifying the duty to hope. Douglass recognised that no one in the black community had the luxury of despair, because that would paralyse action. So instead, even at the bleakest moments, he and his comrades continued to write and speak, to organise and lobby politicians, to provide practical assistance to those enslaved or at risk of trafficking, to seek pragmatic expression of their idealism. Slowly but inexorably, they turned the tide of their history, and they began to overcome the entrenched systems of violence that sought to deny their humanity. Contemporary forms of slavery and racism are in every country of the earth. Like historical forms of slavery, contemporary forms are the products of political systems and political choices. Choices to underfund education, particularly for girls, to remove workers' rights, to tolerate and sometimes encourage racism and xenophobia, to victimize the powerless, and to privilege the greed of the powerful over the rights of the vulnerable. If this makes you angry, it should, because to make the world less outrageous, we must first be outraged. Indeed, we must be outraged enough to make ourselves unpopular with those making the decisions to maintain the systems of exploitation, neglect, and exclusion across the world and at home. We must take that outrage and control and shape it through the power of words and argument, through protest and leadership, to reshape the politics of our age. Let me give some examples of what that can mean in practical terms. Business people can check their operations and supply chains. Educators can teach history. Lawyers should not prosecute victims. Medical professionals must be open to the possibility that sometimes the people sitting in front of them may be enslaved and in need of protection. Trade unionists should expand organisation to at-risk workers and support international ratification of the Forced Labour Protocol of 2014. Politicians need to advocate for funding for the implementation of the Forced Labour Protocol. Forced Labour Protocol requires ratifying countries to develop anti-slavery and anti-trafficking plans, but those countries which are most affected by slavery and trafficking often do not have the financial means in order to fund those plans. And to date, there's only about 23 countries which have ratified it, in part because of the lack of resources for implementation. Politicians must end tied visas in the UK and Ireland and beyond and everywhere. Politicians should close markets to slavery, tainted goods, support the education in the global north and south, and make human rights central to the political economy. And this is going to be a major issue over the coming years as the authoritarianism of the current British government grows and begins to attack the most fundamental instruments, such as the European Convention on Human Rights, which constrain their power. Citizens can campaign for the reform of the political economy, can question businesses about where they source materials from, can question politicians about what they're going to do. You can fundraise for education projects, such as Children in the Crossfire, it's a Derry-based education charity. And you can campaign to remove racist symbols and attitudes. Someday, John Mitchell is no longer going to stand in the centre of Newry. Ireland today, north and south, is thankfully a much more multicultural country than it was when I was growing up. Our traditions now are not just orange and green, but Chinese, Indian, Nigerian, Ethiopian, and Polish as well, amongst other vital and vibrant European, African, and Asian communities. To echo the words of Desmond Tutu, we are also becoming a rainbow nation, and we will be all the better for it. But there are traditions of collective action in the cause of human rights that we should never forget, and which we still urgently need in the years to come if our country is going to fulfill the promise of its people. Perhaps Bobby Kennedy reminded us, a few of us individually have the power to bend history. But the history of our times is shaped by numberless diverse acts of courage and belief, and it is these that ultimately twist the moral arc of history towards justice. To protest is to lead, and our duty to hope means we must never forget that. Thank you.